Good evening, everybody. Welcome. The first thing we want to do is I'd like to thank Dr. Margaret Peacock for coming to give us our talk this evening. Also, special thanks to the European Institute for hosting this evening, and the Harriman Institute for co-hosting the evening. My name is Victoria Phillips, and this lecture is a part of the Cultural Initiative through the European Institute, which also hosts 2 classes, and we're lucky to have many of the students here, Cold War Power and Women as Cold War Weapons, and also the Cold War Archival Research Project, among other things. So welcome this evening, and I'd like to introduce Dr. Margaret Peacock. She is an associate professor and director of undergraduate studies in the Department of History at the University of Alabama. She completed her PhD at the University of Texas in 2010 and is trained as a Russian historian, but sees herself more as a global historian of propaganda and media. She has published articles on international youth festivals, radio propaganda in Vietnam in the 1960s, the uneasy implementation of Lysankot science, is that correct? How do you pronounce it?
Lysenko.
Lysenko, thank you, science in the Soviet Union, and visits by curious Americans to the Soviet Union in the 1980s. She wrote her first book, Innocent Weapons, which our class has read for today. Her second book, Frequencies of Deceit, uses Russian, American, British, Egyptian, Cuban, and Israeli sources to tell the history of international propaganda to the Middle East in the first 3 decades of the Cold War. Thank you.
Thank you in particular to Victoria Phillips for inviting me to give this talk and for assigning this book. We all, come at our stuff pretty convinced that we don't know anything and that nobody really cares to listen to what we have to say. And it's nice to know that books have lives and that they're getting read. My father, who was an epidemiologist, gave a talk at Columbia in 1975. My mother told me this at dinner 2 days ago. She said the talk was on maternal mortality rates in the Deep South in the 1960s and 70s, and she told me that he would be proud of me if he had known I had come, and he's passed away, so that made me feel really good. So today I want to talk about a prescient topic. I want to talk about what the propaganda of the Cold War can teach us about living in the post-truth world. So, not to be political, but this can be super political. In particular, I want to see if there are historical object lessons to be learned from the propaganda battles of the Cold War that can help us to understand and navigate the seemingly unprecedented crisis of information faith that is happening around us, a state of being that has been labeled post-truth by academics and the media. First, we would do well to try and get to the meaning of this new word in our vocabulary, post-truth. What do we mean by it? More importantly, is it really new? I'm a historian, so I bet you know how I'm going to answer that. Post-truth was the 2016 Oxford Word of the Year. I don't know if you guys knew that. Maybe that's not so much a surprise. According to Oxford, it describes a world in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief are. And I must admit that I don't see what's new about that. Public opinion's always been shaped as much by appeals to emotion and personal belief as it has been by fact. Think of the blood libel in Trent in 1475, right? Or the writing of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in 1903. Or, the New York Sun's, 6 articles in 1835 about the discovery of trees and beaches and man-bats living on the moon. All of these were total hoaxes that appealed to the emotional desires of their readers, such to the extent that they were willing to overlook the need for evidentiary proof. So I think we can all agree that that is an insufficient definition. Thank you, Oxford. The thing that seems to make post-truth a new phenomenon comes not from the willingness of populations to rely more on belief than on fact for building their worldviews, but from the decentralization and polyphonic subjectivity of those worldviews as they are produced and consumed. In other words, there is something new to who gets to produce information and how audiences consume that information. So in terms of production, whereas in the past the production of information sat in the hands of the church, or in the 20th century in the hands of this pretty powerful state that had thorough control, or at least pretty thorough control over the flow of information, Now anybody can produce information and advertise their own subjective narrative. And in terms of consumption, there can be no question that throughout the 20th century in the Soviet Union and the United States and most of the Western world, the way that people consumed most of their information was intimately controlled by a small number of people sitting at the heights of power. In my first book, this was what I witnessed. I traced the image of the child in the Cold War and discovered that the US State Department and the Soviet government wielded lots of control over how images of children were manufactured for public consumption. And they used this power to initiate massive national propaganda programs with the image of the endangered child at the helm, all done to convince their domestic populations to embrace their own containment, their own surveillance, and the abrogation of their civil rights. Now, on the surface at least, it seems as though we are living in a world where everyone can be a media channel, where everyone can be a producer of information, and where as a consumer, you could theoretically build your worldview based on anything you choose. So instead of basing your worldview on the information given to you by the church or the state, like it used to be, you might instead, choose to base it on what, Kylie Jenner and Tucker Carlson choose to retweet. Now, theoretically, each individual's worldview is cultivated by information coming from wildly different sources, all of which create deeply subjective ways of seeing the world. Now, I'm going to come back to this at the end of the talk, but let me say right now that I don't believe that everyone is a media channel, and that information has become nearly as decentralized or as subjective as we'd like to believe. It's a sad thought, but in the ways that matter, the internet and the rise of post-truth, the post-truth world, have not allowed the subaltern to speak. I don't know if Spivak's here, but there she is. I'm shouting out to Spivak. They have not ushered in the era of subjectivity that we were all hoping for. As a producer of information, I may have a Twitter account, but if no one listens to me, I am screaming into the void. The only way that I can be heard is if my message reinforces one of a limited number of possible, increasingly polarizing meta-narratives that already exist around me. These meta-narratives are mostly controlled by the same people who have always controlled them. They demand the use of a certain semiotic and linguistic lexicon if I hope to be included in the conversation. The state, the plutocracy, the media conglomerates all still play critical roles in shaping the narratives that we create and we consume. And they have figured out how to make a tremendous amount of money, functioning as curated echo chambers that channel populations into particular aggregated demographics. They do this either by producing stories that reinforce the underlying needs, beliefs, angers, and prejudices of their collective audiences, or by offering up the tools whereby audiences can aggregate, reinforce, survey, and curate each other. Now, the fact that we somehow believe ourselves to be individuals creating deeply subjective realities for ourselves based on our consumption of disaggregated information is, in my opinion, itself a pretty astonishing propaganda feat. As Jacques Ellul noted back in the 1960s, propaganda is most powerful when it makes individuals feel as though they are being spoken to individually. Individuals are most easily influenced when they feel as though their own subjective experience is somehow being addressed. In reality, of course, propaganda is only concerned with individuals insofar as they have something in common with the mass, the same motivations, the same feelings, so they share the same myths, and ultimately behave as a mass. And they buy into the one meta-narrative, right, to use the post-structural term, the worldview that is being fed to them. While leaders lay claim to the truth, they are also willing nowadays to admit shamelessly that they lie, or, to be more accurate, that the fact checkers might be wrong. And a significant population does not see that as a cause for alarm anymore. Claims to the truth now are tinged with doubt. Truth, along with its cousin peace, we were just talking about this, has become for many an outdated, quaint, sort of ironic term that nobody really sees as being meaningful anymore. I think the thing that terrifies us, and let's agree we're all sort of terrified, isn't the rise of subjectivity. I think many of us, particularly those of us who are interested in post-structuralism, are actually in really great support of subjectivity. No, the thing that terrifies us is the rise of these all-encompassing meta-narratives that now seem to exist simultaneously. Like, there are a couple of them, that don't seem to be able to agree on basic facts and events, that don't have a shared language where words carry agreed upon meanings. The word corruption, for instance, just this last week, seems to be the latest on the chopping block that has lost any kind of agreed upon meaning. One could argue that we are currently living in a moment of narrative instability. The other thing that seems new, these are even more, this is just people disagreeing about the whistleblower. Not just disagreeing, but telling utterly and imminently different narratives. Full-on different worldviews, encapsulated behind that one thing. The other thing that seems new is that instead of having one meta-narrative fed to us from birth by the hegemonic state, which is something that most of us in the West experienced throughout most of the 20th century, there are now a few of them, or at least two, all representing the varying interests of the plutocratic world that we now inhabit. All of this seems to threaten not just democracy and civil society, but the ability of human beings to communicate with each other. They seem to threaten the fabric of the rational universe upon which we all hope to build a shared reality. And this, I think, is what post-truth means. It's the clashing of these polarizing worldviews or meta-narratives. It's a clashing of meta-narratives that are fueled by an added disregard for the importance of truth based in fact, that have captured and divided the attentions of audiences. We live in a world where we are hammered on a daily basis with these wildly different ways of understanding the world that all exist simultaneously in the same place. Now, when we look for the causes of this seemingly new phenomenon, the scholarship seems to be centering on three different shifts that have happened in the last 30 years. In the search for an answer to how we could have lost our ability to care about the importance of objective truth, some journalists have traced the cause back to the rejection of objective truth that happened during the postmodern turn of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. Foucault and Lyotard, you guys maybe read them, taught us that truth was not an objective phenomenon, but was instead a construct built up by discursive regimes intent on the surveillance and policing of populations. They were incredulous about the idea that there could be epistemically certain narratives about anything. Instead, they argued that truth was a constructed thing, contingent on historical and social context. While the postmodern turn was incredibly important in opening paths for understanding otherwise forgotten narratives and for exposing the semiotic and discursive structures of power that shape our world, some journalists and scholars argue that it also exposed us to the erroneous argument that if there is no one overarching narrative, then anyone can make up whatever truth they want. Post-structuralism helped to beget post-truth, the argument goes, and we are all left now trying to figure out how to move forward from it. A key intention, actually, in my new research is to upend this claim. I want to argue instead that the post-truth world we see around us actually exists as a product of the very discursive regimes that have wielded power in the West for the past 200 plus years. We are experiencing what we are experiencing, if we can get to it here, what we are experiencing here may seem like a new phenomenon, but we've seen it periodically in the West before, and the colonial world has been living with it for centuries, where claims to truth are tinged with such hypocrisy that truth itself stops being a goal. Now, all of this has come, of course, to the fore with the rise of the internet. And it's here that the information and propaganda play such a key role in helping both to create and undermine the meta-narratives and the hegemonic discursive regimes that define our world. And it's here on the methods and significance of post-truth propaganda that I want to focus for the rest of today. The internet is, of course, probably the greatest irony of the 21st century because it promises individual expression and is simultaneously the greatest propaganda tool ever invented. Now, we are left with the question of how to respond to this phenomenon. And to be honest, I absolutely do not know how to answer that question. Like, how do we deal with all this? I mean, it is the question of the day. This is the moral panic of our era. But I do think that I might have some historically rooted suggestions on how to think about the phenomenon and to recognize the mechanisms through which it is constructed. So let me make a first point, the first point that all historians love to make, which is that none of this is actually new. The propaganda methods of constructing a given meta-narrative that will incite populations to action beyond reason, haven't changed since propaganda became a modern phenomenon tied to the creation of the nation state in the 19th century. We can see these methods in use, for instance. Are there any Russianists in the room? All right, well then this one's, maybe you won't have this one, but you can sort of see this, for instance, in Nicholas I's construction of the notion of official nationality. It was sort of the first articulation and big nationwide propaganda project in the early part of the 19th century in Russia, or in the American notion of manifest destiny. But perhaps the best historical example we have of this phenomenon can be found in the Cold War, which was a global experience that spanned 40 years or more, depending on who you ask. I'm not going to go into that. And created a propaganda leviathan, right, that pitted one massive hegemonic power against another. For American and Soviet domestic populations, there was one and only one meta-narrative that was supposed to provide what Jacques Ellul described as a complete system for explaining the world. The messages and methods used for constructing these discursive regimes that were supposed to explain everything, give you a full-on, replete, and rich understanding of your universe, were time-tested and incredibly powerful. Then, so here I am making the argument about how it's not new. So then, as now, it was possible to make almost any argument from, oh, you guys really can't read that. I'm so sorry. Then, as now, it was possible to make almost any argument from the abundance of facts that seemingly lay at our disposal. And one could do it, seriously, to support almost any ideological stance, then as now. Take, for example, the 1957 Moscow Festival of Youth and Students. This, I don't know if you guys have had a chance to read up on this, but this was a massive event hosted by the Soviet government in 1957 to promote a revised rendition of the new Soviet man, committed to peace, and we will talk about masculinity and peace if you guys want to, which is actually a thing in Russia. It's not a feminized thing in Russia. The festival was intended to stand as a symbol for the nation's apparent rejection of the social and cultural isolationism that had characterized the Soviet Union in the early Cold War years. They held massive Olympic-style processions filled with images of Soviet youth as activists for peace and creative contributors to world culture. They staged conference panels where Soviet students demonstrated Soviet wealth and benevolence to the post-colonial world. Soviet propagandists then delivered this massive narrative about the festival in a deluge of radio, television, and newspaper stories intended to solicit loyalty and pride among the Soviet population and then international audiences. So there's that information being used to pitch a particular message. But at the same time, the US government used the exact same processions, exact same conference panels, exact same speeches being said by the exact same people to make a completely different ideological argument. Whereas the Soviet government pitched the processions as manifestations of the nation's commitment to peace and its popular support for the Soviet state and its Cold War project, the U.S. State Department and the American news agencies argued that they were examples of Soviet mass brainwashing and coercive manipulation. When they covered peace rallies, they argued that the actions of the people in the peace rallies were somehow scripted. That's a quote, that they bore the trappings of a latter-day Nuremberg. And they used the same data to tell two completely different stories about what was happening on the streets of Moscow. Each of those narratives were parts of a much larger meta-narrative intended to solicit a certain response among domestic populations. This is perhaps obvious, but it's important to recognize how information can be manipulated to do almost anything. Then, as now, ideological, by the way, those right here, you guys know what these are? You ever seen these before? These are bone records. So it was a kind of Soviet resistance, a practice among young people. You'd get a hold of, to bootleg records, to bootleg rock and roll records, they'd use X-ray film because it was strong enough to actually record music onto, and so they're called bone records, and they're very highly collectible. And if you can get one, you're awesome. But this was how bootleg music was shared, was on old X-rays in the Soviet Union. Kind of cool. Okay, so then as now, ideological divides did not seem to change the way that propagandists did their jobs. And that's another way that we sort of see similarities between the Cold War propaganda project and what's happening now. In the research for my first book, I discovered that the Soviet and American propagandists built their programs based on the same messages. Both sides, here we go. Both sides argued that only they were able to make their populace happy, either through material or spiritual wealth. Both argued that their sacrifice in World War II had earned them the right to claim legitimacy to lead the post-war world, back to peace, back to modernization. Wrapped up in this was a steady articulation of the sacredness of each nation's historical mission, whether they were fighting for capitalism and consumption on the backs of George Washington and the American Revolution, or communism, Kulturnost, and peace on the backs of Lenin and Stalin. Both sides argued that if people wanted to keep their children happy, they're going to have to be willing to do what it takes to defend them, even if it demanded giving up the rights that their socio-political system was ostensibly built to ensure. They would have to mobilize in defense of their nation and in defense of the status quo. Similarly, both sides constructed elaborate images of the evil people on the other side of the Iron Curtain, who provided a sufficiently harrowing vision of the enemy to justify mass mobilization and the waging of the Cold War, potentially forever. In the Soviet Union, this meant identifying Americans as, cursed by want and poverty, lost in an ideological vacuum, impoverished by violent racist bourgeois imperialism. And in the United States, this meant seeing the Soviets as bound and roboticized into a state of conformity and inhumanity by an oppressive regime. For both sides, it was a potent propaganda message to argue that the other regularly victimized its own children for its own venal goals. And then, like now, there can be no doubt that both sides made an industry of existential fear. Like, just fear, maybe not existential fear. I don't know, I've been thinking about lately about the connections between existential fear and how it leads to people's desire to behave in irrational manners. I just listened to a podcast on Hidden Brain about it, and so that's what I listened to this morning when I ran around Central Park, and so that's what I got in my head. So there was this industry of fear. There was this constant message that the enemy could not be trusted to follow the rules of war, that it would break the rules of civilized men if it profited them in some way. This was coupled by the message that domestic populations might not be strong enough to stand up to the enemy, and so they were going to have to mobilize themselves, get stronger, get tougher, follow the rules, do what they were told in order to be strong enough to face this massive threat. And all of this was wrapped up in a siege mantra, a steady buzz of anxiety and worry that would ostensibly lead everyone to imagine their own individual experience of attack. Does any of that sound familiar? And all of this, so you can sort of see this, and all of this, just then as now, the methods used to convey these messages were the same. So the methods were the same. And these are the standard tricks that you guys learn when you take Propaganda 101, which I hopefully, not too many of us are doing that these days, or maybe all of us should be doing that these days. But, omission, name-calling, testimonials, transfer, glittering generalities, the plain folks argument, that one works really well these days, bandwagoning, card stacking, and whataboutism, which is the new one that's, actually it's not new at all, right, but it's the one that everybody seems to be using. So the Soviets and the Americans used all these tricks. And a central tool to all of these practices, to all of it, was the rewriting of history. And this is something that I'm really beginning to sort of see as a critical component to what it means to manufacture consent. As we all know, the historical record can be altered to suit the new narrative of the day. The lasting fungibility and power of history in constructing state legitimacy is a terrifying phenomenon. Through the 1950s and later, Soviet leaders and propagandists worked really hard to position the Soviet Union as a historic defender of the Polish, for instance, right? This was a common mantra. We are the historic defenders of the Polish. And of course, we can look around us right now and see that happening, right? The recent rehabilitation of the Soviet World War II narrative that the Soviets never forcibly actually occupied Poland with the Germans in 1939, right? That's the new standard story. The point being that all of these tools were mobilized by propagandists and leaders in both the Soviet Union and the United States for the same purposes. So for example, in the late 1950s, in response to the fear of hooliganism at home and the concomitant weakening of the nation that was bound to come from it. Kennedy's and Khrushchev's governments both passed wide-sweeping laws like the Youth Offense Control Act in the United States, the hooligan reforms in the Soviet Union, that were intended to give the state a foothold into the private home. Because juvenile delinquency represented now a national security threat, both sides were able to argue that they had the right to police not just the children, but the family, the parents. Whether it concerned voluntary enlistment of citizens into housing committees, which is what happened in the United States, or comrades courts, which is what happened in the Soviet Union, or instructions on how to be a good father, which happened on both sides. Somebody asked me that question, like, what's a good father? And I thought, man, that's a tough question. That happened on both sides. The state worked hard to pursue this sort of state organization of domestic life. Now, when we read, you guys, if you've read my book, you know this is sort of the big payoff. When we read the history of the Cold War through the lens of its propagandists, the ideological differences that seemingly differentiated the Eastern Bloc from the Western sphere are tempered by the revelation that Soviet and American leaders and propagandists were engaged in similar visual and rhetorical projects to sell a war, to preserve power, to justify policy, and to maintain domestic order. The Soviet Union and the United States might have been ideologically divided, but in the end, it was the Soviet and American propagandists who had the most in common with each other. They shared the same methods and often the same goals, the same messages. In many ways, the Cold War was defined not by an ideological split, which I would argue is largely a propaganda product, but by a split between those who owned the means of image production and the intended consumers of those images. Now, all of this sounds eerily familiar. What do we have to learn from it? Well, I think maybe a warning first, that these grand narratives of being a great nation on a noble mission that's under siege from a venal foe are really only loosely tied to ideology and far more to the maintenance of power through the unification of people by generating feelings of being under siege, being left behind, or being taken advantage of. Even during the Cold War, when it seemed like an ideological battle was happening, the propagandists were nonetheless focusing their attention on generating certain feelings among their audiences and on the manipulation of identity politics. I heard Ezra Klein the other day argue that ideology is dead as a propaganda tool, that it was a propaganda tool during the Cold War, but it's dead as a propaganda tool now, and that really propaganda is all based on the manipulation of identity politics. But I'm honestly not sure ideology ever really was one. Nonetheless, we'll talk about that maybe later. You guys can fight with me about that one. The lesson is clear, though, that propaganda can be very powerful if done well, especially with people who don't know how to recognize it. Which brings me to my second point, which maybe has some hope in it, because that was pretty hopeless. My second point is that Western hegemonic meta-narratives are always in the process of undermining themselves. We have seen this periodically in the West in the last half century. The propaganda message that only the state could protect the nation's innocent, threatened children might have been useful in the 1950s as a tool for the preservation of the status quo. But if you guys read my book, you know that by the time you get to the 1960s, the hypocrisies and contradictions in these claims had become way too blatant to ignore for huge swaths of the Soviet and American population. Soviet writers and filmmakers used the image of the Soviet child abandoned by the state and destroyed by war to lodge a critique of the state's claim to defend its young. Meanwhile, American civil rights, anti-nuclear, and anti-war protesters put children at the fronts of their marches, positioning the state as the killer of the babies. The very image that had been so instrumental in the promotion of state legitimacy became the same image that ultimately undermined it. In the Middle East, where I've done my latest research, I've discovered that Arab populations were subjected to a completely different scale of propaganda intervention from the Western world for decades. Not only that, but they were hammered with a whole variety of worldviews coming from the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, Egypt, and Israel as they fought for Cold War position over the airwaves of the Middle East. And I didn't realize this until I started writing my second book, The Frequency of Deceit, which examines the global history of Arabic language propaganda in the Middle East in the second half of the 20th century. I've spent the last 6 years learning Arabic and slowly piecing together the actual transcripts of what was said over the airwaves of the Middle East to Arabic-speaking audiences. And I've made what I think are some interesting revelations that feed into this larger question of what does the Cold War and really the post-colonial world have to teach us about how to live in the post-truth universe. First, state propagandists used all the propaganda methods and messages that I've just talked about on their audiences in the post-colonial world in very similar ways. So for instance, both the Soviet and British radio stations spent hundreds of hours attesting to their support for Arab national self-determination, their belief in the need to end colonialism, their fear of Zionism. Forgive me for the lack of images, now we're into radio, so there's no pictures, it's boring. The British worked really hard, for instance, in 1947 to show that they offered the better alternative to Soviet tyranny. We should ram home to the peoples of the Middle East, the head of the BBC declared in 1947, that our policy is progressive. This meant showing how Britain was promoting social reforms, raising standards of living, delivering British technicians to help in local development projects. They needed to show that British wasn't wedded to reactionary elements, meaning that Britain wasn't hell-bent on propping up pro-British dictatorships in the Middle East. Theirs was a country, they argued, that led the way in social reform, with a democratic system of government, social services, organization of industry and labor, administration of justice, that made the British way of life, if I had a British accent, I would say that with a British accent, one that offered the best example of orderly and rapid progress. That was the message that would win the day. They were sure of it. In their broadcast to Palestine in 1946 and 47, in the build-up to the partition, they decided that they would conjure images of Moscow's impoverished suburbs and the barren pantries of the Soviet countryside with their long lines for the basic necessities and their citizens quaking in fear, and have that sit in contrast, to this image of great benevolence that Britain was offering to the Arab populations of the Middle East. At the same time, from their stations in Baku, Radio Moscow was taking full swings every day at Britain and its Palestinian quagmire. On a standard day, 1 hour of Soviet stories included incendiary titles like Imperialist Intrigues in the Arab East and The Palestinian Question and the Venality of the United States. Moscow declared that they were really cumbersome with language. It takes the Russians a while to figure out not to use the big words. They talk a lot about it internally, but they can't seem to get it out. They can't seem to change. It takes them forever. So Moscow declared that the British and Americans were using the situation to retain their imperial power in the region. They argued that the United States and Britain were using the ever-increasing gravity of conditions in Palestine as a pretext for violence and the preservation of control. The British will remain where they are, Radio Moscow declared one evening in mid-October of 1947, so right on the eve of partition, making sure to point out the hypocrisy of Britain's promises to give a homeland to both the Jews and the Arabs in decades past. Feudal Arab circles and reactionary Jews remain the tools of Americo-British meddling. That was a title to a Russian broadcast. Yeah, they figure out the titles eventually. Now, my research has shown that the airwaves were saturated with colonial meta-narratives that were in constant and explicit war with each other. So if you turned on the radio on any given day, you could change the frequency of your medium wave radio. The whole point of my project was to see if I could just turn on the radio in November of 1947, when the partition vote happened, if I could reconstruct what it would have been like to turn the radio on that day, and then that's how it took off. But on any given day, you could change the frequency of your medium wave radio. I should add, by the way, that radios in the Middle East were super popular in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. So popular that vendors couldn't keep them on the shelves. It was the standard form of socialization. People would go to a tea house and they'd listen to the radio. By the time you get to the end of the 50s, everyone's got one in their house. You could change the frequency of the radio, and you could hear Radio Moscow tell a completely different version of a story than the BBC, which was different from Shakal Adna, which was different from Voice of the Arabs, which was different from Voice of America. In 1956, the Voice of America, Radio Cairo, and Shakal Adna, which was the British covert station that ran out of Cyprus, and Radio Moscow regularly claimed that the other stations were lying and that they were propagating fake news. When Khrushchev made a speech in support of a détente between Egypt and Israel in February of 1947, the VOA reported to Egypt that Soviet fealty was not to be trusted. Radio Moscow's response was as follows: "We should like to say frankly that the Western propaganda is a lie, for the Soviet Union is simply interested in safeguarding and consolidating peace in the Middle and Near East." In 1956, when the VOA declared that the Soviet Union was lying when it claimed that it would offer funding for the Suez Canal, Radio Moscow declared, "Many lies are appearing about the Soviet Union's policy and its readiness to continue to offer economic and technical aid." And they warned their listeners not to heed the, quote, "fabrications of the Western propagandists," reminding its listeners that the Soviet Union offers aid backed by intelligence and experience, while asking for nothing in return, of course. When Dulles proposed an international occupation of Suez that August, Radio Moscow declared that any expressions of respect coming from the United States to Egypt should only be understood as hypocrisy. Accusations of mendacious treachery flew in every direction, every day, all the time, for decades. What is perhaps most disturbing after hours of reading broadcast transcripts from every source is the lack of common space for dialogue and the distrust and the anger. It's all there all the time. And there's a lot of power behind all of this, a power that's hard to ignore. It's dangerous to ignore. If there's a lesson to be learned from this, it is to recognize that propaganda always defends those in power. That is, it is pervasive. And that it informs the language that we use to articulate and understand the world around us. The damage done to the Middle East by this willingness on the part of the colonial world's information brokers to abjure a commitment to truth in exchange for Cold War fealty. I mean, here they are, right? Is there any real truth going on in any of that? Right? They're willing to give up their commitments to truth in return for this pitch for Cold War fealty. The damage done is hard to ignore. Your own Chakravarti Spivak, for instance, has used Foucault's idea of epistemic violence to talk about how non-Western worldviews were destroyed to make space for the dominance of Western ways of seeing the world. This assault arguably contributed to the Arab turn away from the Western secular solutions in the 1970s and 80s. Scholars like Rashid Khalidi, yes, another Columbia professor, have seen this in their work, tracing the rising disillusionment and anger of subject populations who'd been forced to accommodate themselves to Western truths, betrayed by Western promises, left destitute by Western exploitation. So the failure of Western propaganda to the Arab world has been documented. In part, the failure was due to a lack of understanding of target populations. The West didn't understand their target population. And that's what's been argued by other historians like James Vaughan and Peter Hahn. But in part, their failure was due to the experience, I think, of this conflict of meta-narratives, this experience of there being, I don't know, like a multi-narrative. Okay, don't quote me on that. I'm being recorded. I don't know if that's the right word or not. But like something like that, you can tell I'm not quite there yet. You never know what your book is about until you totally finish it. The constant exposure to so many contradictory narratives. For Arab audiences, the Cold War divide between the Soviet Union and the United States stopped mattering as much, with populations looking for alternative paths to individual, group, and national identity that were rooted in religion and tradition and the rejection of the relativity of Western secularism and the hypocrisy of colonialism. So if we want to understand the disorientation that has come now from living in the post-truth world, perhaps it would make sense to look to the post-colonial world and the experience of living for decades in a space where empty claims to truth undermine the idea altogether. And that's it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out whether what you're saying is that propaganda is something that is inflicted by ruling elites on the population, because it seems to me that one characteristic of the Cold War is that the propagandists themselves believed their own propaganda.
Right.
They ate their own cooking. You know, they really came to believe it to the point where they themselves could not distinguish truth from falsity.
Okay, so I think that there were some who drank the Kool-Aid and there were some that did not. And in the archives, when you really look at the organizational level stuff, like in the state archives, when you see them in their meeting minutes, they may buy the ideological pitch, but their conversations about how to go about making it work are very much not rooted in, a sense of sort of commitment to American, morality. They are mobilizing the mechanisms, the old mechanisms of propaganda in a deeply pragmatic way. But I think you're hitting on another interesting question I thought you were going to go at, which is propaganda itself something that is just sort of a top-down experience, right? Is propaganda something that's solely constructed by the state and by propagandists and then, sort of forced down the throats of the population? Or is it something that we conjure, right? Is it something that we create and recreate over and over and over and over again until it just becomes, something that we put in our baby's milk? And I think the answer is the latter, right? That it is not something that it is something that exists in the cauldron of discourse, right? That we eventually, in very much the Foucauldian sense, right, sort of reimpose upon ourselves over and over and over again. I spoke with a friend about this idea the other day, and he said, wait, do you mean that we now, in the modern world, because we are all doing that now, right? I actually got off of social media after I started writing this book because I became so upset about the fact that I was helping to construct the discursive regime. Right? But what he asked me was, wait, so are we being colonized? Like, are we colonizing ourselves? To what extent are we curating ourselves? Are we limiting ourselves and our own ability to be subjective? And I think that's a really great question that I still sort of have to unpack.
You mentioned, you said that the propaganda systems within the U.S. and the USSR were very similar. And if I can reference largely the arguments of Noam Chomsky back in the 80s, is that the U.S. and USSR systems were actually very different. The one in the USSR was entirely state-controlled, and while the U.S. also had a state control, it was neither were very effective because everybody recognized that they were state propaganda. But in the U.S., you had much more effective system of propaganda was the entire media system. And it was not so much that they were accepting messages from the state, but that it was messages from the capitalist class, which controlled both the state and the media. So you had the New York Times and Washington Post essentially set the Overton window of who was an acceptable voice to be heard within the media, and that is what dictated ideas about state policies regarding U.S. military imperialism. Now today I'm thinking about largely in Syria, we have a very heavy critique of Donald Trump's policies pulling out.
Sure.
And it's very clear that Donald Trump does not control the media, especially the New York Times and the Washington Post, who are owned by the capitalist class, Carlos Slim and Jeff Bezos. So, Donald Trump, he makes a lot of attacks on the fake news media, who are in support of essentially the EU's four freedoms, freedom of movement, of people, capital, people, and goods.
Mm-hmm.
Now, regardless of those benefits, how they affect the rest of us, they clearly benefit the capitalist class. So today, who is really the propaganda? Who is the fake news? When Chomsky might look today at the New York Times and Washington Post
And see those as well.
and he might even agree with Donald Trump in his accusations of those.
I think that Chomsky would make the argument, which I find myself not wanting to do because I love the Post and I love the Times and I certainly would pick them over the King in Orange. But I think he's right. I think that what we are experiencing. This is the place where I am. I am still pondering it. But I think that what we are experiencing are two relatively hegemonic meta-narratives in existence at the same time. There's the one that's coming from the right and there's the one that's coming from the left. Both seem to offer a fully replete explanation for everything that you would, every question you would ever have in the world, right? Both have full answers, and both are arguably owned, by the plutocracy in one form or another. So yeah, I think that Chomsky's critique would be right, as distasteful as that is. And that might be a part of what it is that we are experiencing now, of this cognitive dissonance that we are experiencing now, right? And it might be one of the reasons why we are having such a hard time figuring out how to talk to each other. Because these are two full-on, fully replete meta-narratives that have a full discursive lexicon associated with them, right? There's a whole vocabulary built up to create both. I really don't want to get into defending that too much, because I still would prefer to read the Times over Breitbart, but there you go.
The producers of propaganda are also concerned about reception.
They are.
Whether it was the German General Staff in World War I, trying to make sure that the message was properly received, or, Hitler's minions who, checked to see whether the message was being received properly. And I suppose even the Times and the Post
are concerned with reception. Well, of course, they're concerned with how many clicks they get.
Yeah.
I mean, everyone is.
Exactly. And what letters, are they going to publish, and what's working?
I mean, there's a monetization of all of it, right?
Exactly. And we're learning more and more about that. There was a little article about the Times makes money, getting feedback on who's reading what.
Yeah.
So how do you work? And how do you work this into the monoliths?
Right.
The monoliths are also, what are they doing? They're not completely monolithic. That doesn't say anything.
They aren't. But if you're asking about reception, are you asking about reception?
I'm asking about reception.
So propagandists are never really able to do reception, right? That's the great problem of being a historian of propaganda, is that reception is just a bitch, right? It's just so hard.
Polling doesn't really.
Well, I just finished reading Pomerantsev's new book, and he makes the argument that we now finally live in a world where propagandists, like scholars of propaganda, can in fact track reception through clicks, through looking at how many. I mean, I can now look at what you look at. I can now go to Cambridge Analytica, and they will tell me. Well, they're gone, but you know what I mean. They will tell me exactly what you look at. They will tell me what you see, and in fact, that the ability to track reception itself has become monetized.
But
we are
clicking. But clicking, you and I can both click an article and read it in a different way.
Well, sure. So
we're still not getting to reception.
Okay, sure. Yeah. No, agreed. I mean, I myself don't dip my toe too deep in the reception pool. Because I have, you can, I think, begin to get at what the producers of information are trying to do and say. Mm-hmm. You can get at that.
And how it's produced. Yeah.
How it's being produced. You can get at their intention. You can maybe get at the conveyance, how it's conveyed, how it's moved across, how it's put out in the universe. Those are two of the three steps, right? There's the production, there's the conveyance, and then there's the reception. But the third part is always difficult, right? And you have to just be very careful that you don't make too many assumptions about the impact of the material itself. I mean, there are ways to do it, right? And there are ways to be convincing, but you still have to be careful, You can only sort of put out ideas at that point. It's just a symptom of the nature of the field. Yeah, sorry.
How do you distinguish between state propaganda, which has always seemed to me to be pretty clunky, because it's sort of just by its nature, and psychological warfare, which is sort of the covert manipulation through radio broadcasting and culture and things like that? Because it seems to me we know that state agencies, intelligence agencies do psychological warfare, and a lot of it was through the radio because of the lag of television, especially in the third world. So to me, it seems like there's a kind of a blurry line there. I wonder if you have sort of dealt with that.
So in this next book, I am dealing with it, and I try really hard to just separate the two out as much as possible, right? So when I'm talking about, Soviet state propaganda coming from Radio Moscow, and everyone knew it was coming from Radio Moscow, then I'm pretty clear about that. And there is definitely a difference. The only people who really do the psychological operations stuff super well, at least in the 1940s and 50s, or at least they're the ones who at least try. I don't know if they're doing it well. Actually, they're not doing it well. They ultimately fail anyway, are the British, right? Who actually have 3 or 4 big, highly funded, covert, like black radio stations running. But the Russians do a bad job early on of really bringing in native Arabic speakers who are going to be able to sort of infiltrate regular stations, find regular listeners and get heard. And the Americans are terrible at it too. The USIA doesn't even really, the Americans don't even really start broadcasting in Arabic until the mid-50s, right? We don't really see any saturation until the mid-50s, until Suez really is when the Americans finally start to get involved. So the Americans are late to the game, and they have to play catch up, by the time we get to it, in both the covert stuff and the overt stuff. Yeah.
But the Americans have a huge operation. I mean,
they do.
Little Wizard's Wurlitzer. And I also was thinking of the Soviet propaganda around AIDS in the 1980s. This was a sort of a Fort Detrick plot.
Sure.
And
I haven't looked at that stuff, honestly. I really have only looked at Arabic broadcasting into the Middle East. That's the project, right? And the project goes from 47 until, at this point, right now at least to 67, up to the Six-Day War. That's where I'm stopping. The plan was to go to 79, and then I realized I was overwhelmed. So that'll be the second book. Anyway, yeah.
I'm a vegetarian.
Oh yeah.
Particularly Spivak.
Who does?
Yeah.
Who doesn't love Ezra Klein?
Seems to be her. But I was curious. You talk about how the internet promised to give a voice to the subaltern. Maybe it didn't make that promise, but the hope was that it would.
It certainly was, yeah.
And Spivak and the post-colonialists would describe the subaltern as peasants and maybe women. In your view, in the American context, who are the subaltern right now who don't have a voice?
You mean in the United States?
Yeah, because I guess I often think about the working class and minorities, people who in the past weren't given much media attention, now being the main benefactors of the internet as a platform.
Yeah, I mean, if she would not be okay with that.
No, not at all.
We don't need to go into that. We could go call her. Maybe she'd come over. But we aren't allowed to sort of appropriate that term. We Westerners are not allowed to appropriate that term and sort of say, well, I had a hard childhood that makes me subaltern. You know what I mean? Or I'm a minority in the United States that makes me you have to be really careful about appropriating that term. So, I think that there's that. But in terms of what populations aren't getting heard, I would think that it's the populations that are refusing to buy into these meta-narratives that we sort of all have to buy into if we want to get heard. If you aren't sufficiently outraged, that's a Shankar Vedantam episode that I just listened to the other day, right? If you aren't expressing sufficient amounts of outrage, you're not going to get heard. If you aren't sufficiently angry right now, you're not going to get heard. And you have to get angry about particular things, or you're not going to get heard. So if you are yourself approaching these top items, these hot stories with a little bit of circumspection, you might not get heard. The great example is the students who were the Catholic school kids who were from, was it Wisconsin? The Catholic school kids who were on the mall with the Native American guy banging the drum. Do you guys remember that story?
Yeah.
And the story came out and everyone, sort of took to the ramparts, and there was a great expression of outrage. Like, everybody gets to be outraged. Come to the outrage party. And everyone is furious. And then later on, the story comes out that they show more video, they show longer videos, and it's a way more complicated story. It turns out that those kids didn't just like confront this guy, and that they were actually being taunted and treated really these kids were being taunted and treated really terribly by another group of people who were really angry, and it's just it was a really complicated moment. But if you're on the left, it was not okay to get on Twitter and say, you know what, I made a mistake. I read too much into that at the time. Turns out, this kid may have been a little punk, but he wasn't nearly the horrible, horrible human being that we all sort of pictured him to be. You guys are already angry at me for even saying that, I'm sure. But that was actually that's the truth. Like, the truth is, it was a really complicated situation, and yet but it was not okay to do that. Like, you were not going to be able to say that and get heard. So that right there is a regime, right? There's a discursive regime that's only going to allow you to say a certain thing, and that's no different from what we saw in some ways. I mean, I think in many ways there's a lot of shared similarities from that to what we see here. By the way, I'm not actually a journalist, or I'm a historian, but I can't, like the rest of us, I can't stop thinking about this stuff. And certainly as a historian of propaganda, right, you can't ignore what you see, happening. So anyway. Yeah.
Well, you were asking about private media, and I was sort of curious about state media, modern state media.
Yeah.
Right. The Modern Voice of America, Russia Today, CCTV, and whatnot. And I was sort of interested, how different do you think they are from Cold War propaganda, state propaganda? Was the end of the Cold War the end of some epoch in propaganda making, or is the techniques they're using basically the same?
Yeah. Yes. This is. I mean, certainly now in the Soviet Union, yeah. I mean, the news outlets that are trying to do anything independent are increasingly, getting shot. The journalists are increasingly getting, sort of through force or through trolling, right, being basically sent into the margins. So no, the methods of propaganda are the same, and maybe that's not a big revelation, right? That there are these tricks that work. If it's not broke, don't fix it. What's different, of course, is that the scale of it is, it's happening now. I think in a global sense, in ways that we maybe didn't see before. I don't know. Maybe the scale is different. But no, I think the methods were the same. I mean, what you're asking. Russian news media is pretty much controlled by the state now, right? There's very little sort of independent news media in Russia now, and they have to be very, very careful because they're always walking a tight line. I mean, in the United States, if we're being good Chomskyists, it's not, it's plutocracy controlling it here too. This is so depressing. I'm so sorry. None of us are free. Yeah.
There is a certain freeness to the internet.
Don't kid yourself. No, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding.
I think that, for one, I'll say I appreciate seeing the continuity between what came before and what's happening today. I think there's hope in that, and that we can look in the past and draw some lessons.
Mm-hmm.
But regardless of the nature of propaganda during the Cold War, there were some gatekeepers, always, right? It's either the state or it's the media elite, the plutocrats.
Mm-hmm.
But today, any kid, I could go on the internet, I could make a meme, and I could post it, and I could get 7 million shares or retweets or whatever it is. Or someone can make a deep fake of Trump encouraging violence on journalists. How does that change the processes and the lessons that we can learn from before?
Okay, so I myself would not know about the deepfake if I hadn't read about it in the New York Times. You see what I'm saying? I'm concerned that we just need to be really careful in acknowledging that, you might go and make a really, a terrifying, you might go and do something that's going to become viral, But it's going to become viral in very curated ways. It's not like its virality, if that's a word, is somehow going to happen in a spontaneous manner. It's going to happen because there are people making sure that it happens. I sound like a conspiracy freak now, don't I? There you go.
Well, what about spaces like 8chan, where, you know, neither like the state nor the media want to even touch that, and like, isn't that like free?
Yeah, I don't know. You
Is it so awful? And,
well,
disgusting?
yeah, are we really going to talk about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd need to think about it, because this isn't a history topic, but it would strike me that there are, so if you look back to the Cold War, when there were moments when populations got together to say stuff that the hegemon didn't want them to say, it took a mass, right? It took a great mass of people really choosing to come together to say something else for it to work. And you know, I'm still pondering this idea, but is it possible that our anxieties, these moments of crisis, happen during these moments of narrative instability, right? So 8chan's fine, right? Because it poses no threat. It's fine, right? It's a little blippy thing. There's no risk to the hegemon from the existence of that. And so there's no real need to deal with it in one way or the other. It was the same with Women's Strike for Peace, right? Like, we don't have to deal with a whole bunch of women getting together to fight about strontium-90 in their milk in the 1950s. Like, who cares about a bunch of housewives getting together about, to get upset about nuclear material in their children's milk? But when they got together, right, and they made their way to the floor of Congress, and they made a mockery of HUAC, then it became something that had to be dealt with, right? And then they become an alternative narrative, right? And for instance, the late 60s might actually be not that far off from the moment we're living in now. Like, if we're really trying to get a handle on what narrative instability looks like and how it makes people feel like they don't have a tether to what the truth is. Maybe the late 60s is a place to look to, where you have the Nixon types, and then you have, the anti-war types, and those are two totally different populations of people, both of whom are significant. They're large, just big groups of folks, who are positing completely different ways of understanding the world. And that action, that sort of moment, that confluence of narrative instability maybe is where that anxiety is sort of rooted. I don't know. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I wanted to ask one question because, propaganda is put out because there's an ideology.
Yeah, well, maybe.
Well, I mean, certainly in the Cold War, we look at it as an ideological battle, yes? In other words, there were...
I mean, some do. Not everyone.
Not everyone,
yeah.
But what I always look at is there was a hope for what something looked like in the end. So there was a 5-year plan, right? Now, maybe we never got to that 5-year plan, but there was a goal. There was some sense of, this is what we believe. This is where we believe things should go. Now, whether or not that is true, whether it's constructed, there was some sense of a goal in the end.
I mean, by the 1970s, ideology was dead in the Soviet Union. It was dead. There's no question it was gone. It was a dead idea. No one bought into it. It was, you pretend to work, I'll pretend to pay you. You pretend to be excited about communism, and I'll pretend to be excited about communism. Like, it was a... There's this really great book called Everything Was Forever Until It Was No More. Have you had a chance to read this by Sergei Yurchak?
Yeah.
You guys should all read this book. And it's all about sort of the emptiness of Soviet ideology. I think the 5-year plans were far more a method of domestic containment. They were projects rooted around domestic containment and the policing and management of populations than they were real. I mean, the first 5-year plan was actually not real.
So in that case, we're in the United States when we were fighting this kind of a boogeyman called communism.
Yeah, not real.
not real, just
No.
like the housewife wasn't real.
Right. No, and it was good, but damn, did it make a really good straw man, right? Nice foil. Right, a good thing to mobilize a population to fight against, even if it didn't really exist. Yeah.
Can I say that I think it really did exist? I really do think it was an ideological war at the heart of it.
Okay.
And I think it was fought out, and I think it went through various stages.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the stages that you point out is a very interesting stage when consumerism sort of took over, when Khrushchev took over, and I think it's at that point where there's a kind of revival of a new form of peaceful coexistence, Soviet ideology, as opposed to hardline Stalinism, which essentially Khrushchev wiped out during his speech. And I think the United States propaganda itself had to readjust because the two famous examples of this are Nixon and Khrushchev at the sort of kitchen conference. And to me, my favorite is Khrushchev not being allowed to go to Disneyland.
Yeah.
but it shifted. So the propagandists who were really both from the United States and the Soviet Union were sort of locked in kind of Stalinist mentality. All of a sudden, their propaganda seemed very dated and almost kind of archaic when the paradigm shifted in the late 1950s. And I think it shifts at different points, throughout the 60s, and then in the 70s. I agree with you that the ideology sort of collapses, but at the same time, you have this agreement between Carter and Brezhnev on human rights, and so it's a different form of the Cold War. And then it reorganized itself again under Reagan. I don't think Reagan thought that communism was an invention.
Evil empire.
Yeah, I think he believed it was an evil empire.
Could I just pick up on
Yeah.
that? Yeah, the ideology begins to diminish, but it gets fought out in the third world. Who's going to win the hearts and minds of the third world?
Well,
Is
it's
not
really
really
what
thinking
happens,
that.
whether it's your project, the Arab world, whether it's going to be in Africa, our world, according to Kissinger, was going to stand and fall on what happened in Angola.
I mean, you guys have all read your William Appleman Williams, right?
Yes.
Okay, so
Who was
Yeah.
an isolationist, a left-wing isolationist.
yeah. Okay, so I myself am very much a skeptic about the actual role of ideology, certainly on the ground for general populations. And I think it was a handy tool far more for the mobilization and management of domestic populations than it was an actual, belief system. But we can disagree on that. And there's certainly, this is a massive debate in the scholarship, that's been around for a long time.
Right.
So, yeah.
You evoked in the presentation, just completely different topic, but fatherhood and peace.
Mm.
And so that's something we talked about in class today. Thanks, Victoria, for your presentation. And so I was just curious to hear more about that and just.
Well, what did you say in your presentation?
Well, I accidentally discovered the fact. So I'm Russian.
Yeah.
I was born and raised, and I knew that there is no association between women and peace. So at least not to
No.
the degree that
It's
it's strong
yeah.
in the United States. So, and I started looking at posters, and it was a few weeks ago before we read your book and had to do anything with children. And I kind of discovered that there is this strong association between man, friendship, and peace.
Yeah.
Right, the kind of this triadic sort of relationship that happens, and I did like a small presentation in class, and
Nice.
I guess it comes as a surprise to a lot of Americans.
Yeah, no, we were talking about this, and I was like, no, peace isn't a girl thing. Peace isn't a girl.
Yeah,
It's
and
not a
it
girl
was
thing.
Very surprising for
It's
me
not
as a
feminized.
Russian being like, well, I don't know, I never associated women with peace, like not in my head. And
Well, I mean, in the United States, no question, right? The men go off to war. The men, even seeing détente as itself, a masculine, sort of pragmatic foreign policy move. So détente isn't peace, right? Détente and peace are two separate things in the American conception. But in the Soviet conception, détente is a path to peace. Détente and peace are on the same track, right? They are not diametrically opposed. One policy is definitely feeding into the other. Yeah, there's no question.
Yeah, I feel like I kind of have, it's a hypothesis, right? I don't have any empirical claim, but it seems to me that the ubiquitous of war experience in Russian families.
Right.
And, you know, the number of men who
Yeah.
died, they were the kind of almost natural
Yeah.
heirs of, you know, those who could potentially promote.
Absolutely.
Right.
It's not that far off from, if you think about the Japanese commitment to peace, right, which is not at all feminized, right? These are I'm sorry?
The Germans, too.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, right. So these populations that really experienced like the full horror, and the Russians the Soviets arguably experienced it worse than anyone. You know, peace is not something that women are the only ones who it's not a niche project, you know, like it is kind of in the United States. Actually, my next book, the one after this, I think is going to be on this very question. It struck me not too long ago when I was doing an article on Samantha Smith for Diplomatic History that people don't write songs about peace anymore. Like, what happened to peace? Where is that? And where is it in Russian? Where are the Russian songs about peace? Because Russians used to write lots and lots of songs about peace, and they don't write songs about peace anymore, and the Americans certainly don't either, and that's shocking. I mean, Dylan wrote so many songs about peace, and yet nobody's writing them anymore. And I think the roots of it go back to the Cold War and the Cold War killing it. I think the Cold War killed peace. It made it a niche idea. It made it quaint.
So we were talking about this on the way over, and maybe this goes into my question about ideology, and the sense that there are goals to attain: peace, truth, spirituality, or whatever you want to call it, right? These are core positively stated values, not bring back what was, the othering, yes?
Right.
So
But everybody has them.
Right, everyone has them. So so we were talking about whether the U.S. Cold War approach to truth and the commodification of truth with truth dollars, and Soviet lies versus U.S. truth and all of that. Did it kill this sense of truth that it is just something to be bought and sold? Home ownership, state control of healthcare. There are goals, values, desires that we don't hear about very much anymore.
Yeah. Yes, I think yes.
So
I agree.
So is that, do you see that as a Cold War phenomenon?
I think that the jading of the ideas happened then. I think that the great promise, there is this great promise. There are these wonderful ideals that seem to emerge out of the Second World War that seem to be the bandying points. They're the great touchstones of the decades, right? There's the 2.5 kids in the house in the suburbs with the right? The Ford or the truck, right? And then there's the ideal of and of course that's a white vision, right? That's totally white. And then there's the ideal of peace, and there's the ideal of there being this pursuit of truth. And they're lovely, but the truth is that over the course of the next 40 years, they just get thrown around so much. That language gets tossed around so much and abused so much by so many people that it stops having any meaning. It just becomes meaningless. It becomes cute. I fight for truth. Who says that? Nobody says that, right? Even people who are fighting for something they think is truth don't say they fight. Although, doesn't the Post say truth dies in darkness? I like democracy dies in not truth, democracy. You're right.
But in all this, washing machines and suburbs and all of that, there had to be fear.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah, and I think this is important.
Oh, yeah.
That whole atmosphere that, you can't enjoy, it could be taken away from you tomorrow. Really important book by Havel, The Power of the Powerless, the day that the greengrocer, takes workers of the world unite away from his store. With the checks in November of '89, they weren't scared anymore.
Right.
They simply, people who've never gone out in the street in 38 and 48 and 68 went out in '89. They stopped being afraid. But now fear, well, maybe you can go on with this. Fear seems to be not just being manufactured, but being what?
Oh, it's monetized.
Crazy.
It's totally monetized.
Be
But it
very
was then
afraid.
too.
Be very afraid.
Right.
I mean, we all wake up. What is it? Samantha Power said this in an interview.
Yeah.
I wake up every morning and I had under my pillow.
Right.
When will we like this?
Oh, I mean, I have full-on anxiety attacks on a regular basis about the stuff that I read in the news, right? I mean,
this is
we all have this, and it's related to fear. It's related to a sense of impending personal attack, you know. And there's no question that
ISIS is going to show up tomorrow because of what's just happened.
Or
in Syria.
for my children, there's a school shooter that's going to show up in my school tomorrow, and that's the real one. That's the one that everybody's really afraid of right now.
But isn't it the idea that like fear just became so petty in a way that everybody now has their individual fear rather than against a common enemy, common enemy that we're afraid of?
Well, we have climate that we can all be afraid of.
And Trump, we can all be afraid of him.
Well,
I'm just kidding. I'm just
in this room.
I was joking. I'm not really.
That is a large group,
Yeah.
If you believe, okay, but you know, the water is going to rise. We're all, you know.
No, I think it's alive and well now. But you brought up something, which is there is this moment, right, in '89 when, there is this moment. Fukuyama declares at the end of history. It's such a great moment, right?
But it's not a peace moment.
It's not. It's
There was not a peace made at the end of the Cold War.
It's a victory.
Well,
I'm just kidding.
Maybe.
I'm really being. That was my Gaddis moment.
I think that unresolved '89 is something we're trying to deal with also.
Yeah.
I think it's extra depressing when you say that there was no real ideology in the Cold War because it's still being sold in Latin America. So where there was like this threat of communism and the US intervened, it's still this thing and they keep stretching it out, and we've never had a communist party that's effectively gotten power in Brazil, and that's still sold to elect right-wing
For sure.
Like that, the whole propaganda for the right in Brazil is anti-communist, and I don't understand.
And it's
how
not
been
real.
stretched this far. When
And
there
it's
is
not
no,
real.
There is no communist ideology effective and scholar in Brazil, so I just don't understand. Like, I'd like to understand how the propaganda crossed so many borders and still exists.
Oh, and it's everywhere. I mean, if you think about Duterte, right?
I think the presence of Cuba is something that's really become instrumentalized.
Right. Yeah. No.
And maybe-
Instrumentalization is the right word. No
And
question.
now they call Venezuela, like, they
Yes.
use that as well, and they're like, oh yeah, is that the communism you
Yeah.
want? And like, no one's saying that's the communism you
Yeah.
want.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that communism is instrumentalized. I think that's exactly the right word. Obama was a communist, right? And
It was a Muslim
used-
communist.
No, right. And it was used in
Born in
placards in
Africa.
Washington, and you walk by, you think, wow, that ended. Communism ended.
Exactly.
The Dixie Chicks were communists. Okay, but it's more a slur term left over from the Cold War than it has any ideological meaning. Like, in the end, we are all going to live in a utopia, and this is what it looks like according to writings. Yes.
I mean, I don't think it doesn't wield very much power necessarily in the United States anymore. Communism doesn't. Socialism still does.
Yes.
You can call, JOC a socialist, and that hurts her seemingly, right? But yeah.
I wanted to ask you just about the nature of propaganda, because I think you were saying there was a continuum, but it seems to me it's changed.
Huh.
That at one point, the propagandists were really trying to convince people the truth of what they were saying. And I think now the strategy is more just to get out there with as many narratives as you can so you can convince people that it's impossible for them to find the truth, and to depress them so that they won't even try to find the truth. You yourself have said you're depressed. And it seems to me that the methods of verifying the truth have always been out there, and they're just as valid and as effective today as they've always been. And if the nature of propaganda has changed so that it's not, because no one believes American propaganda and they don't believe Russian propaganda, they know it's all bullshit. But their strategies have now changed to saturate people with as many versions so that they they're in a tizzy and they just can't figure out where they are and what to think.
That's exactly what
And
I see in the
there are
Middle East.
very effective strategies against that. There's nothing to be depressed about.
Oh, well,
And
thank
that-
you.
Excuse me?
Oh, well, thank you. You're reassuring. No, but I'm what I'm saying is, actually, that's what I'm arguing in this next book, right? Is that if you want to see a historical record for that, you go to the post-colonial world. That's where we see that very thing happening. So there is a precedent for it. It's not here. It's there. It's in Palestine. It's in Egypt. Yeah.
I'm curious about the commodification of Cold War semiotics and what that means to people today. Like if you go pretty much anywhere in Eastern Europe, walk down the streets, at all of these market stalls, you can get Soviet-style Ushankas, you can buy Karl Marx T-shirts, all sorts of crazy things. You can pay hundreds of dollars to go on communist site tours of different cities. What are the discursive power structures that people are buying into when they purchase those goods?
So Svetlana Boym has written a great book on this, about the power of nostalgia and the sort of the commodification of historical memory. It's a genius book, but and that would be where I would lean on, right? So what we see happening, right, is it's just the commodification of an old moment. I mean, it's complicated, right? And to be honest, having lived in Russia for a while, there's real human memory that matters. Like there's people really trying to earnestly connect up with their past. When I was an undergrad, I was in Russia as a study abroad student. In the spring and summer of 1992, like what parent lets their kid go to Russia in 1992? That was crazy. I can't believe my parents did that. But because it was chaos and you couldn't find a meal, and the gangsters ran the place. Thank God for the mafia. In the Kremlin wall, there's Stalin's grave, and I remember standing there watching an older woman put flowers on his grave and weep. And I remember, having just taken my undergrad course in Stalinist history, just being fully scandalized by this, because I understood that this was a man that had, potentially killed upwards of 20 million people, and how could a woman weep at the grave of this maniacal monster? And my Russian friend turned to me and said, "Well, that was her childhood. That's her. She was young and beautiful then. Those are her memories." And so a part of the sadness of the commodification of that, right, is the sort of the emptiness of the memory itself. You can now go, if you've ever done this, right, you've been to Eastern Europe, you've seen those markets, you can buy war medals for pennies. Back in 1991, you could truly buy, in the mid-90s when Russia was in full, chaos, people were selling orders of Lenin for $20. They were selling Kalashnikovs for $20. There's, and it was because everything was so awful. People would sell their most precious possessions. I bought an 18th century Torah for $10. I know. I feel really guilty about it. I was thinking about giving it to the temple down the street, because there's a temple down the street from where I live. I should give them this Torah, because anyway, so there's that, right? And there's this, now it's sold, and then it was sold back, and I think that Putin would not like it. He would like that not to be happening. It would be better if it weren't, but it's commodified, and it's a reflection of, on the one hand, the continued value of those objects, and on the other hand, the emptiness of meaning, right? The fact that these objects have been sort of emptied of meaning. I don't know. We could talk about it. You should come to dinner. I'd love to ponder that question. I think that's a great article, by the way. That'd be a great research project. Like, what are the larger implications of these markets? The rynki.
All right, well, with that, we'll end. Thank
I
you
didn't even
so
get to
much.
answer you guys' awesome questions.
Well, then let's not end.
No. It's okay. We can stop. It's after time. But, I got asked one really good question, which was, how do you do this kind of research? And I don't know if you guys want to talk about that stuff.
Yeah.
But the answer is it's the opposite problem that most historians have. Most historians are scrambling to find material. The problem with this book on the image of the child, as you can imagine, was that it was too much, right? It was just you're drowning in the material. And that's also the case with this next book on broadcasting, right? I mean, how many thousands of hours of broadcasting are there? And the other problem is getting a hold of the sources themselves, certainly now. Interestingly, the broadcasting companies didn't keep track of their own transcripts. Like, they didn't track what they were actually writing. The BBC did an okay job of it, but nobody else did. They kept their internal organizational documents. And so there have been lots of people who've written histories of propaganda into the Middle East where they go and look at the organizational stuff. But there's a reason why nobody's actually looked at what's getting said over the air. And it's because it's just like nobody kept track of what they were saying. Interestingly, though, because it was the Cold War, everyone was keeping track of what everyone else was saying. So if you want to find out what the Russians were saying, you actually go to the CIA archives to find what the Russians were saying, or you go to the BBC monitoring service, which was also tracking what folks were saying over the air. The same goes for Radio Cairo. The BBC was really tracking what the Egyptians were saying. The research has been, for this next book, has been in some ways much harder than the first, but it was all about, I mean, this is what these kinds of projects, this is what all projects are, right? You go off, you collect all the material, and rarely does one know what story one is going to tell before one actually starts to really plow through it. Even after you've plowed through it all, you still don't really know what the story is until you start to put it down on paper. And sometimes even then it takes multiple drafts before you really start to see it. So there's that. Doing research in Egypt is really not tenable now. I had 2 research assistants quit on me because they were worried of, state services, the state finding out they were working for a Westerner. And I was trying to work in the Egyptian broadcasting archives, and that was definitely, not really safe. There have been multiple scholars who've washed up in the Nile recently, so that research is hard, and I've had to triangulate that stuff because it's not safe to work in Egypt anymore. But for the semiotics project, it was all about tracking images, and then doing actually some pretty boring old nitty gritty tracking an image, keeping a database, writing down what you see, really kept a mega database of everything that I saw and how it was characterized, how it was pitched, where it came from, what were the key sort of motifs and themes, and then trying to sort of pull them all together using, my limited ability to manage statistics.
Let me ask one other question that came up in class related to this, which was how do you, and this goes into the question of language.
Yeah.
In order to look at these sources, you
Right.
need language, and you acquired language.
Right.
And then what do you do about cultural knowledge? So
despite the fact that I was functional in Arabic, there was no way I was going to be able to do that work without a native Egyptian speaker sitting with me through getting through the materials. The same actually applied when I was in grad school. I had a friend from a previous trip who was a professor at MGU who was willing to sit down with me this was back in the noughts, I guess, and even then, professors at MGU don't get paid very much, despite the fact that it's an incredible, very prestigious university. They really don't get paid very much, and she had a sabbatical coming, and so I had a 9-month-old baby when I was doing my dissertation research as a Fulbright scholar in Russia, and so I just took the baby with me, and I hired her as my nanny, and she would watch the baby during the day, and then in the afternoons I would come home with all of my archival material, and every afternoon she and I would sit down and plow through it really quickly, and she would say, this word, it actually has 4 different meanings, given the way that it's being phrased here, and then we would hash that out. And she didn't speak English, but she was able to really help me start to sort of see the deeper meanings. So unless you grew up as a native, you're only going to have limited abilities with reading. Right now I have 2 Arabic-speaking research assistants, native Arabic-speaking research assistants at the university, who meet with me constantly to get through material. Yeah, you just have to do it. There's no way to get around it. But that's a good question. It's not cheap.
Yeah, that was it.
You have to find grant money.
Yeah.
And it's important that you speak it, because you don't want to, you also, you need to learn the language. Like, it's just an integral part of the work. Like, there's no getting around that. Yeah.
All right, well,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much.
Thank you, everybody. That was great.